thank you for inviting me, and thank you for letting me talk about that group of people who seem to vanish from American history all too frequently, that is half the population, women. It always has struck me as odd that a home front war, which is what the American Revolution was, waged for 8 years. Apparently, in the eyes of many historians, women did not notice it was going on. It was fought in their backyards, it was fought in the fields of their farms, it was fought in their towns, it was fought in their cities, but apparently either they were all suffering from a strange catatonic state or they were on drugs, because nobody mentioned that they were there. Some of us in the past 30 years have tried desperately through very serious research and also through restraining ourselves from knocking heads, have tried to explain to our colleagues that in fact there's a story to be told about the American Revolution that is not just about the founding fathers, not just about George Washington, but about that part of the population that helped make the war a success. So that's what I want to talk about with you today. The war begins before the war. That is in an era that I do not allow my students at Baruch to call the pre-revolutionary period, because people didn't know the revolution was coming. History is often taught as if people could look at their watch and say, oh, it's only 20 more days till the Renaissance begins. But it isn't true. In fact, right up until 1776, many people did not think that the revolution would take place, that there would be some accord between the British and the Americans they governed. But during the period from 1765 until 1776, there was certainly conflict between what they called the mother country and the colonies. And the greatest conflict came because Britain changed its policy toward America. For almost 100 years it had practiced something called salutary neglect, which meant basically, they're not worth really governing, just leave them alone as long as they send their raw materials to us and buy from us and don't smuggle too much from the French. It's fine, we don't want to spend the money to police them. They changed their mind after the French and Indian War because the British government was broke, and they said, let's go in there and enforce every law we have. Not unlike in New York when suddenly the police start arresting you for jaywalking. It means they need the money, the city needs the money. So they introduced a whole series of what the Americans considered to be very novel and oppressive laws. And they began to enforce laws about who you could trade with, and in fact they passed a stamp tax, which was the very first direct tax on the colonies. Well, the men in the colonial legislatures rose up and orated their brains out. Give me liberty or give me death. We actually have no idea if Patrick Henry said that, by the way. He never recorded anything he said. He didn't write it down. And I tell my students in my most cynical mode, perhaps he just said, give me a ham on rye. But we'll say he said, give me liberty or give me death. Lawyers wrote briefs explaining why this was illegal on the part of an infringement of the British Constitution. Our agents, the American agents in London, campaigned with the Parliament, and the response to them was generally ho-hum. The colonies were not, and this is the hardest thing, I think people who teach American history here will agree, the hardest thing to persuade students is that America was not the most important place in the world in the 18th century. As one of my students once wrote, from the minute the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, I hope this child is not going to be a sailor, landed on Plymouth Rock, America became the most powerful, important country in the world. The British viewed the colonists as, those are those debtors and prisoners and prostitutes, all those people who couldn't make it here. They're off in those colonies over there. Most of the people in Parliament had no idea whether Virginia was next to Massachusetts or whether New York was in the north or south. We were not important. I used to tell my students, we were the Boise of the empire. And one day a student put his hand up and he said, I'm from Boise, and I resent that. So now I say we're from the Mobile, Alabama. That's where I was born. And so far, no one has protested that. The British didn't pay any attention. What they began to pay attention to was when the Americans decided that, as a protest, they would boycott all British manufactured goods. And the British Industrial Revolution was taking place based largely on sales of manufactured goods, especially textiles, to America, wool cloth to America. They didn't call it a boycott because that term was invented in the 19th century and they couldn't wait around for it. So they called it non-importation and non-consumption. Who do you think made that boycott work? Women did. Women were the consumers of that cloth. Women were the consumers of that tea. And women were organizing themselves to enforce that boycott. In fact, if they found a merchant in their town who was selling British goods, the women would picket the store. And the Massachusetts Spy, a local newspaper, carried an article that said the women marched in martial array, far better than our militia has ever marched. So women were responsible for making that boycott work. They would spin cloth at home so they wouldn't have to buy British cloth. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever worked a spinning wheel, but I can tell you, because I tried, I can tell you that the only activity more boring than spinning is watching bass fishing on ESPN. It is the most tedious, unpleasant experience, and as soon as American women could buy British cloth, they all stopped spinning, a generation before the American Revolution. And yet they dug up those spinning wheels and someone showed them how to do it again, and sometimes 100 women would gather on the local minister's lawn and they would spin what they called homespun, and the women called it Liberty cloth. And that's very important to think about, because what it meant is these women were being politicized. I would maintain that the most radical thing the revolution produced was the instantaneous politicization of American women. People who had been told their entire life, you have nothing to do with the public sphere. You have nothing to do with politics. You don't speak up in a crowd. You don't speak in church. You are confined to the home and the nursery. And all of a sudden, they're out doing something that they know is a political act, and that men understood was a political act. And conservative men complained about it quite a bit. One conservative man said, "Virtue sheds a tear when women leave their proper place." But women did in droves. And interestingly, overnight, ministers who'd been telling women to be silent and obedient to their husband are now giving amazing sermons in which they say, our liberty depends upon our women. So instantly, they became a political force in American society, and Britain repealed every one of those acts except the Tea Act. They repealed the Stamp Act. I love when my students write, the British were oppressing the Americans. The Stamp Act is repealed before it's ever initiated. The Townshend Acts are all repealed, and they're all repealed because the market for British goods drops precipitously, and this is because of women. It's also true that women were the leading propagandists against the revolution. Mercy Otis Warren, who was the sister of one revolutionary leader and the wife of another. Mercy Otis Warren wrote the plays that gave the hostile names or derogatory names to all the American men in office, in political office, who sided with the British. She wrote 4 or 5 plays. Now, in New England, you couldn't perform a play because of their Puritan heritage, but you could read the play, and they were published in the newspaper. They were published anonymously. And Mercy Otis Warren, you don't want to read these plays. They're dreadful. I mean, they're really, really terrible. But she's the one who names the governor of Massachusetts Rapatio, the greedy one. And she's the one who names his assistant Brigadier Haydall. And of course, all the heroes that will be the heroes of the revolution are given names like Brutus, right? All the Cato, all the heroes of the Roman Republic. At one point, Mercy Otis Warren sort of stops writing, and John Adams writes her a letter, and he says, "Come on, Mercy, we need another play. You need to write another play." And Mercy Otis Warren does her best Miss Piggy's imitation, and she goes, "Moi?" And he says, "We don't have time for this. We know you're the one writing these plays. Go ahead, write another one." And indeed, she did. She also is the first person to have written a history of the American Revolution, 2 volumes, the very first history that we have. Women wrote the poems in the newspaper that served as recruiting devices. Basically, they told the men they were ninnies because they weren't signing up for the Continental Army. Where's your patriotism? Where's your love of liberty? Get out there and sacrifice yourself for the good of the American Revolution. When the Home Front War began, that is when independence was declared, and the Home Front War began, and men went off to war. Largely it was a farming world in the 18th century. Women were left behind to manage the farms. Now, I always have students who say to me, "Boy, they must have loved that. Finally, some responsibility." Actually, in the 18th century, you could not order in pizza if you were having a hard day. In the 18th century, women did all the skilled work that took place on a farm. Men were the brawn. They went out, and often they pulled the plow because they didn't have oxen or horses, or they hoed the land. I have to be very careful when I use that word in my class. I go, hoe, H-O-E, or else there are titters and laughter from the class. The men did the unskilled labor. The women transformed all the raw materials they produced into usable goods. They called it household manufacturing. So here's a woman, a farm woman. Women got pregnant every 2.5 years until they couldn't anymore. So when her husband left, she might have been pregnant. She had a 2.5-year-old. She had maybe a 5-year-old. Maybe she had miscarried. She had an 8-year-old in a house that did not have those little plugs that made the house, all the electrical units. There were no electrical units, but I mean, it was not a safe place. Kids could walk into the hearth where the fire was. They could get scalded by water. They could walk out onto the land where there was still swamps or dangerous animals. So women had a brood of children to watch over, one of them likely nursing at her breast. And now she also had to go out and do the farming. For most women, this was not a liberating moment. This was an addition of an enormous amount of work for someone who already worked 24 hours a day. Now, if you were rich enough, and if your family had people to do the work on the farm, it could produce some changes in your sense of yourself. A lot of wealthier women realized that mostly what the men didn't require that much intelligence. We have an exchange of letters that is one of the favorite set of letters for all women who teach early American history between a husband and a wife. He was a loyalist, loyal to the crown, and he was virtually chased out of his home, and he went to London. And he starts writing her letters that are the most detailed instructions you will ever see. It's sort of walk to the door, go out the door, go to the field. And she writes him back, "Don't worry, Ralph, don't worry. Your farm is doing fine. 6 months later, he's still writing, do this, do that. She writes, "Don't worry, Ralph, our farm is doing fine." And 6 months later, what do you think she's writing? "Don't worry, Ralph, my farm is doing fine." So clearly something had happened in her life. But for most women, the long period of the war was really an excruciating experience, not only because of the double duty they had to engage in, but because as soon as British manufactures dried up, they had terrible scarcity of things they needed. If you ever saw that dreadful play, 1776, my students all come to class and tell me, "I know Ben Franklin sang in Independence Hall. I know he did. I saw it in 1776. But there is a scene where Abigail Adams sings to John Adams, "Pins, John, pins." Without pins, they couldn't sew. So you see the level, the micro level at which women were deprived of things that were essential to them. They didn't get salt, and to preserve food for the winter, they had to come up with an alternative. They were incredibly ingenious. They came up with a preservative made out of walnut ash. It must have tasted terrible, but it preserved the meat. They were constantly coming up and exchanging in the newspaper with one another substitutes for the things they were missing from England. And finally, they were not safe. Everywhere the armies marched, rape followed. You'll be surprised maybe to learn, or maybe you've been taught this, the majority of Americans did not support the American Revolution when it began. It wasn't just 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It was really 2/3 said, somebody's going to tax me. I don't care who it is. It's not worth dying over. And many a farmer had two flags. The British Army went by. They ran up the British flag. The American Army went by. They ran up the American flag. What changed their attitude was the behavior of the British Army. Everywhere the British Army went, they cut a swathe across the civilian population where these young boys engaged in rape and gang rape. And everywhere they did that, American men began to join the American Army. But these women who were alone on their farms frequently suffered, were endangered by the presence of the armies. It's one reason why General Washington issues so many orders about the behavior of his enlisted men. He wants to make sure that they do not alienate the local population, which is one of the things that made him a brilliant leader of the American Revolution. At one point, he issues a statement, some of the soldiers have gone skinny dipping in a little lake near a town, and he issues an order and he says, "You will not do that. It's an insult to the women of the town. I don't want to see you recruiting for the British Army." So women endured the American Revolution, and if they had not done what they did, there would have been nothing for those men to come home to. A lot of the women didn't stay home. They wrote these poignant letters to their husbands. The enlisted men, of course, were the ordinary soldiers. They wrote letters, "Pray come home, winter is coming. If you do not come home, your children will starve, for I have no food. If you do not come home, they will freeze, for I have no wood." And men deserted the army, not out of cowardice, but to go home to their families. One of the reasons the women had no food is, again, as the armies marched through, they confiscated everything there. They confiscated the crop, they confiscated the furniture and burned the furniture to keep warm in their tents, and decimated the possibility of these families surviving. So Washington did something. These women would come pouring into the military camp in the winter when it settled down. And the people in the 18th century didn't fight in the winter, or rarely fought in the winter, so they would encamp at Valley Forge, at Monmouth. Women and children would come pouring into these camps, trying to find the safety of the American army and hoping to be fed and clothed. Washington hated having them there because they were, quote, in the way. At one point he records, I was trying to move quickly from one place to another, but we had to wait because 8 women were in labor and I had to wait until the children were born. So for him, this was a terrible burden on the army, except it kept the men in the camp. He had few choices. Either the men deserted or the women and the children arrived. When you see that picture of Valley Forge in your textbook, and it shows all guys, that is a lie. Valley Forge was an instant city. It was filled with women, with children, with their dogs, with their favorite goat, with their rocking chair, with their favorite pots and pans. And they all came and settled in the army camps everywhere. Well, the commanding officers put them to work. They did the nursing. Men came down with camp fever. They did the nursing. They gathered the wood and the cow pies and the deer pies to make fires. They washed the clothes. And here I want to discuss the extreme importance of lice in the American Revolution. I have a wonderful son. I adore him. I call him the Prince of 79th Street. He's married and lives in Brooklyn now. Brilliant kid, could take a computer apart, could not figure out how to use the washing machine, right? These boys were no different. The enlisted men in the American Revolutionary Army ranged in age from 14 to 20. And they arrived, they were poor boys. That's who enlists in the Army. The rich ones were the officers. So they'd arrive in whatever clothes they had on. And a lot of military life is sitting around doing nothing. It's sort of like a baseball game. Woo! So they were sitting around doing nothing, and they were bored. And they didn't have video games, and they didn't have anything to do. And they sat around in these same clothes that they arrived in, because it would never dawn on them to wash them. So after you sit around in the same clothes for 2 or 3 weeks, living right next to the latrines you've been digging, because what do they know about hygiene, you get lice. So they were bored. They invented a competitive game, as boys will often do. What was the competitive game? They had all these bites from the lice, and they could see the lice. So they took hot tar, and they threw it at the lice. And at the end, they counted up who had killed the most lice. So now they had bites, and they had burns all over their bodies. And the person in charge of saying to the commanding officers, the regiment officers, how many men are battle ready would show up every 2 weeks, and they say, well, you know, we have about 15 guys who aren't going to be battle ready because they are covered with scabs and they're covered with burns. Washington insisted after that every woman who came into the camp was a laundress. Every woman had to wash clothes, not just for their own husband, but for everybody else. And every place an army went, the first thing they did was put up notices that said, we need laundresses. And this eliminated the lice, and I'm convinced this is one reason why the Americans were ready to fight. The women, you will, of course, not be surprised to hear, only got half the rations the men did, even though they were working every day. These camp followers sometimes were killed, not by the American Army. They were sometimes killed because many of them stayed with the Army when it began to travel again, when it went off to battle. And on the battlefield, in the midst of the battle, wherever there were wounded or dead or dying enemy soldiers, the commanders would send the women out to scavenge for boots and ammunition and weapons, bayonets, because the American Army was poorly equipped. And frequently these women were killed on the battlefield and left to die on the battlefield, like the men who were left to die on the battlefield. In the forts, how many of you have heard of Molly Pitcher? How many of you know there's no such person? New Jersey, in all its brilliance, has 2 rest stops named after women. One is the Clara Barton rest stop, and one is the Molly Pitcher rest stop. They have named a rest stop after an imaginary person. Thank you, New Jersey. Every woman in the forts was a Molly Pitcher. What did that mean? It's like Rosie the Riveter. There was no person named, she wouldn't enroll in St. Francis College, the Riveter, Rosie. There was no such person in World War II. It was a blanket name for all these women in the forts. Molly was a very common name, like Jennifer 15 years ago. And Pitcher, why were they called Molly Pitchers? Because the men who were manning the cannons when they were under attack, I don't know, there's no reason you should have ever worked a cannon, but cannons get very hot when they're fired, and you have to reload them. So you have to reach inside the cannon. You have a long pole, and you have to reach inside to put the paper or whatever, in what's going to catch the spark, and then load in the ammunition, and then load in the cannonball. And if the cannon is burning hot, you can't do it. So the men would fire the cannon, and then they would shout, "Molly Pitcher," and some woman would come running out with a pitcher of water to pour on the cannon to cool it down. Well, when they ran out from the safety of the buildings, the British and the Indians on the outside didn't go, time out, that's a woman out there. They were killed by the cannonballs or injured by the cannonballs, just like the soldiers were. If the soldier fell, if he was wounded or died, women would take up their posts and they would load the cannon and fire it. And that's why you see that iconic picture of a woman loading the cannon. Every instance in which there is something to do with the war, women were spies, they were saboteurs, they were couriers, some of them dressed as men and fought in the army as men. There was not a single aspect of the American Revolution that women didn't play a critical part. So when the war is over, what do women get as a reward for their participation, their patriotism, their love of liberty, their contributions? Well, if you've read the Constitution, you know that they are not mentioned at all. And I have read every word of the debates in the Constitutional Convention for a book I wrote. The subject is never, ever, ever raised unless someone's talking about their wife. People wanted to return to what one of our presidents erroneously called normalcy. No such word, but okay. They wanted to return after the war. They wanted to rebuild their farm. They wanted to take care of their household. The men wanted to come home to their families. And nobody was really interested, or very few people were interested in discussing gender roles in the 18th century. But there was a great gain for women. Until the American Revolution, it was known from both religion, science, and nature that women's brains were too small and too soft for them to think rationally. And by rationally, 18th century people meant make moral judgments about right and wrong. That's why they had to be under the control of a man. But during the Revolution, when women were choosing sides and women were acting politically, that understanding began to fade. And now that they had decided that, in fact, women could think, women could make decisions, they decided that the people who would ensure the continuance of the Republic were mothers. Why? Because mothers would train up their sons to be patriotic. It was the mother's responsibility to teach, we would call it today, socialize their children. Women had never had that role. Always the father was in charge of teaching right from wrong, telling a child how to behave, what their responsibilities were. Now it is the mother. And the mother is to teach the sons to be loyal to the republic, to love freedom, and to be willing to fight and die to preserve it. They used the term Republican motherhood, as in the republic. Women said, okay, we won't be able to vote, we can't own property, we can't keep the wages we earn. We'll take on this job of preserving the republic. But if we're going to do that, we need to, for instance, know the history of the country. We need to know the laws of England that we've adopted here. We need to know political philosophy. We need to be educated. And so in every single new state, even Georgia, in every single state in the new republic, they created young ladies' academies. The first time women were to be educated. And since bureaucrats and school administrators, I hope you'll not be offended, were just as lazy then as they often are now, they didn't create a new curriculum for the girls. They just took the curriculum from the boys' grammar schools that were college prep schools, and that's what they taught the girls. So you begin to have these groups of young women, middle and upper class young women, it's true, who went to school together, who studied philosophy, who studied political theory, who studied rhetoric, who studied history. And what happens when you get educated? You're dangerous. So it may seem like a long time to you, 70 years, but in the great course of history, 70 years is a blip. From the revolution and the rise of these schools to Seneca Falls and the first Women's Convention for Equal Rights is really in history a very brief time. And it is the rise of Republican motherhood that produced the rise of women's education that leads directly to Seneca Falls. So the revolution, I always think of the founding fathers rolling over in their graves when they realized that the ideology they put forward to women that would keep them in the home is exactly the ideology that ultimately carried women out of the home. So let me close with a little quote from a British soldier. As they were evacuating, the British and the Loyalists were evacuating New York City at the end of the war, one of the soldiers said, "We could have defeated American men, but clearly we never could have defeated American women." For a very brief period of time, women who owned property in New Jersey could vote. You all, I'm sure, know that all men couldn't vote. First of all, black men couldn't vote. But if you didn't own property, you had no political voice at all until the 1820s and 30s, when they decided on universal white male suffrage. So there were women in New Jersey who were widows, who might have been left money by their husbands, or they were spinsters whose fathers had left them money, and they would have been, if they were men, qualified to vote, especially in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, which then was a thriving port town. The New Jersey legislators were in a big hurry to write their constitution. Largely, they were worried that poor men who had been told, "Give me liberty or give me death, we're fighting for freedom," might try to vote. So they wanted to get a constitution written really quickly that said you had to have X amount of property to vote. And in their rush, they forgot to say, "and be male." They just said, any New Jersey citizen who has X amount of property is entitled to vote. And so women who paid taxes, these women who had property and had money, they marched to the polls. And they said, it says right here in the Constitution that we are entitled to vote. And for almost 12 years, women in New Jersey voted. People from other states, people from other states laughed at New Jersey. Thank you. Laughed at New Jersey. They said, this is scandalous, this is ridiculous, you're going to be ruled by petticoats. So about 12 years later, the New Jersey legislature revised the Constitution, and they very carefully put the word male property owners in their Constitution, but for a brief period of time. And you know what? The world did not end. Amazingly enough, even though women voted, there was not chaos and destruction. Though, I don't know, it is New Jersey, but there is, New Yorkers are terrible. But for a brief period, women did vote. That's the only place after the American Revolution that there was any sign that women had immediate individual political power. I was telling someone in the hall, actually, that 250 some odd women filed for pensions from the new U.S. government under the Articles of Confederation for war wounds. They had been wounded in the course of battle. None of them got it, but in some cases, states gave them. Right here in New York State, there was a woman named Margaret Corbin, who was one of these Molly pitchers, and she was wounded while she was firing the cannon, and she lost the use of her left arm. She was hit by grape shot, and she lost the use of her arm, and it was really quite excruciating. She actually wound up an alcoholic, probably self-medicating from the pain, and New York did grant her a pension, a veteran's pension, and there's a statue of her in upstate New York. But the majority of women were ignored in their requests for. The only other wonderful example of this is a woman, Deborah Sampson, who dressed up like a man. She was quite tall and she was quite sturdy, and she was working in a house as an indentured servant, and she heard there was a bounty, a bonus you got if you signed up for the army. And she said, So she put on men's clothes and she went to Connecticut. She was from Massachusetts, and she signed up under a male name, and she got the bonus, and she went home and put her dress back on. And she said, this was pretty good. So she did it again. And for reasons we don't really know, because she was illiterate, she doesn't leave papers, she decided to stay in the Army as Private Robert Shirtliff. She was in the Army for 3.5 years. She saw combat. She was wounded twice, and no one knew that she was a woman. I always have students who say to me, didn't they know she didn't shave? Puberty didn't hit at 12 in the 18th century. A lot of the young men who enlisted in the Army were apple-faced, and their voices hadn't even changed. So all a woman had to do, if she had bosoms, is strap them down, and she could pass as a young man. She fought for 3.5 years, and the only way they discovered she was a woman was she came down with camp fever. And when the camp doctor opened her shirt, he went, ooh. She had served so honorably that they gave her an honorable discharge. And when she went back to Massachusetts, Paul Revere helped her get a pension, a veteran's pension. Well, she continued to dress as a man for several years because field work for men paid much more than domestic work for women. What a surprise. Then one day, as she told the man who wrote down her biography for her, she said, it was spring, the birds were singing, the flowers were out. I went into the house and put on my apron and my bonnet, and she got married and had 5 children. When she died, her husband, Samuel Gannett, sued for a widow's pension, and he got it. So there are rare circumstances in which women's participation was acknowledged by governments across the new republic. But most of them fought in and died or were wounded and have been lost until some of us came along and wrote about it, have been lost to history. So I hope you will keep their memory alive. Thank you.